Now, I know what you're thinking, another table saw safety video on YouTube. And yes, I acknowledge there are probably thousands of videos on YouTube about table saw safety. The reason for that is simple. It's because it's critically important. If you're using a table saw, you need to know how to use it. Possibly even more importantly, you need to know how not to use it. But before you scroll away, I'm going to do this video from a slightly different perspective from everybody else. I'm going to be talking about potential table saw injuries from the perspective of someone who took care of patients who had these injuries. You see, in addition to being a hobbyist woodworker, I'm also a retired trauma surgeon. All of the patients that I saw had suffered some kind of traumatic injury. Most of the time they were car accidents and falls. Sometimes there were penetrating injuries like gunshot wounds and stabbings. But I also took care of probably more than my fair share of folks who had had a run-in with a table saw. I haven't seen any other videos on YouTube that have come at this from this perspective. So in this video, I'm going to go over the most common types of table saw injuries that I personally saw and the ways to prevent them. Now, the most common type of table saw injury that you probably hear about are kickbacks. I'm not going to talk about the type of kickback where the wood gets pinched between the blade and the fence and gets thrown back and hits you in the belly. That can be painful, but those kind of people usually don't end up going to the emergency room. However, I am going to talk about the kind of kickback where your hand gets drawn back into the blade. As you're pushing the workpiece through the cut, it's important to keep it pressed as closely up against the fence as possible. However, if there are any stresses in the woods or if you start to lose control of it, the back end of it can tilt outward and the back of the blade can grab the workpiece, throwing it back at you, but also dragging your hand back through the blade. The easiest way to prevent this is to use one of these, a riving knife. As the workpiece comes through, the riving knife actually prevents the back of the workpiece from impacting the back of the blade. I saw several kickback type injuries in my trauma bay, and not a single one of them had been using a riving knife. Another table saw mistake that I saw patients make was cutting a piece that was longer than it was wide. Let me show you what I mean. When you're ripping on the table saw, the long end of the workpiece is pushed up against the fence. That gives you the most amount of control. However, if you're cutting a piece this way, there is very little control and it's very easy to tip the piece one way or the other. As you're pushing it through, it can tip and get caught and force your hand into the blade. The solution for this is not to use the fence when you're making that type of a cut. Instead, you can use a miter gauge or a crosscut sled. Just like when you're ripping against the fence, here the long end of the workpiece is up against the fence, which gives you maximal control. And the same principle applies with the miter gauge. The next most common injury that I saw were folks who were making very thin cuts. There just isn't enough room between the fence and the blade, and as they push their piece through, their fingers would get injured. There are several potential solutions to this. The most obvious, perhaps, is to use a wider workpiece and to cut the thin strip on the outside of the blade. But if you absolutely insist on cutting the thin strip on the inside of the blade, which again, I do not recommend you do, you can use one of these push blocks that will push the workpiece through while keeping your fingers well away from the blade. There are also various thin strip ripping jigs, try saying that 3 times fast, that you can either buy or build. Now, I don't use a whole lot of thin strips, so I don't have one of those jigs. Another common mechanism of injury that I saw were people who would finish making a cut and then reach over the blade to grab the offcut. There's a pretty terrifying video of a guy doing that on a saw stop, and it makes the mechanism fire. It's absolutely terrifying to watch, but fortunately he wasn't injured at all. The easiest and most obvious solution for this is when you're done with the cut, just stop, turn the saw off, wait for it to stop, and then go for the offcut. Or if you're doing multiple cuts, just push the piece off, do your next cut, and repeat. If you don't like the idea of your workpieces hitting the floor, or if you're using a fairly soft wood and you don't want to worry about denting your workpieces, you can do what I did and build an outfeed table. If you want more information about the outfeed table, I'll leave a link down in the description below. But whatever you do, never, ever, 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 ever reach for an offcut. It just isn't worth it. Another common table saw mistake that I saw is not paying attention to where your fingers are, especially when using something like a crosscut sled. As you push the workpiece through, the blade is going to come out the back. If your thumb happens to be here, you're going to lose your thumb. The solution for this that I've seen several people on YouTube do is to build some kind of box that goes here for added protection. That's something that I definitely will be doing in the near future. But far and away, the most common injury that I saw where people lost fingers or hands, these were devastating injuries, were from freehand cuts. With a freehand cut, there's no fence, there's no miter gauge, you just push the workpiece through the blade, and there is no stability whatsoever. There is nothing that is going to prevent that blade from grabbing the back of the workpiece on either side and bringing it and your hand into the blade. In fact, I just saw a woodworking hack video yesterday of how to make a curved cut freehand on a table saw. If you value your hands and your fingers, do not ever do that. Use a coping saw or a jigsaw or a bandsaw. Do not, under any circumstances, ever make a freehand cut on a table saw. Now, I'm sure there are going to be tough guys out there who are going to be thinking, well, I've made freehand cuts on a table saw for 30 years and I still have all 10 fingers. Okay, I've been living in a house for the last 50 years and I've never had a house fire. But guess what? I still have smoke detectors and I still have fire extinguishers, and I make sure they work. Just because something has never happened to you yet doesn't mean it's not going to happen or can't happen, and it certainly doesn't mean that you should do it. Now, there are plenty of other mistakes that you can make on a table saw, but I'll leave those for other videos. Now, I want to make it clear that these are not just theoretical injuries that you might get. These are all injuries that I personally saw during my career. Part of trauma care is prevention. And if I can prevent just one person who saw something on YouTube that they thought, oh, well, that's kind of cool, I can do that. If I can prevent you from doing that and making one of these mistakes and keeping all of your fingers, then this video will have done its job. Well, that's about it for this video. I hope you learned something. If you did, please let me know which was your favorite tip down below. I do plan on doing more safety videos, again, from the perspective of a trauma surgeon in the future. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you next time.